We are learning a Sicha from Chelik Lamed Likutei Sichos on Parshas Toldos. This Sicha is going to explore the interesting idea that we find seemingly contradictory characteristics, if you will, that would be ascribed to Yitzchak. Whether Yitzchak is associated with the idea of Gevura, severity, which in Kabbalah and Chassidus means constriction and din and judgment, or, as his name implies, Yitzchak is from the word laughter, which shows on joy and expansiveness. And how do we reconcile both of these things? And also, how does this fit in with him being the offspring of Avram Avinu? So we'll begin in the text of the English side of the Sicha from the Likutei Sichos, translated into English by Sichos in English. These are the chronicles of Yitzchak, the son of Avram. Avram fathered Yitzchak. In other words, the famous passage at the beginning of our parsha, Elu Toldos Yitzchak ben Avram, Avram held this Yitzchak, that all the Mefarshim are troubled by the seeming repetition. If we're talking right away at the beginning, we're saying this is the offspring or the chronicles, as he calls it over here, the history of Yitzchak, the son of Avram. Why does he have to say again, Avram gave birth to Yitzchak? It's obvious. It says Yitzchak ben Avram. So one of the explanations is what he says as follows. Our sages explain that the purpose of the seeming redundancy in the verse, i.e., restating Avram fathered Yitzchak, is to teach us that not only was Yitzchak the son of Avram, literally, he was biologically born to Avram, but that it was also evident to all that Avram fathered Yitzchak, because his facial features resembled Avram's. The scoffers of the generation, what's called the Leitzoni Ador, were spreading rumors that Sarah had been impregnated by Avimelech, and in order to prove their words false, the Holy One, blessed be He, Hashem, caused Yitzchak's facial features to resemble those of Avram. So then everybody would say and know, Avram held this Yitzchak. So the first part of the pasuk that says Yitzchak ben Avram, Yitzchak the son of Avram, is just saying the history, his lineage. He came from Avram. Avram held this Yitzchak is coming to teach us a further idea that Hashem made it evident to all by making the face of Yitzchak similar to Avram's face, so that everybody could recognize that Avram was indeed the father of Yitzchak. Second paragraph, the various commentaries on the Torah have already raised the question that this idea doesn't belong here in this parsha. To let us know about how Hashem dealt with the scoffers, it seemingly would have been appropriate for the Torah to have taught this concept, that God repudiated the words of the scoffers. It says that Sarah had been impregnated by Avimelech directly following the account of Yitzchak's birth. When Yitzchak was born, since there were all these people that said, you know what, Yitzchak is not Avram's child, so therefore Avram held this Yitzchak, Hashem made him look like his father. Why did the Torah wait until this point, the beginning of Parshas Toldos, to repudiate their statements? The above leads to the conclusion that Rebbe says that God caused Yitzchak's countenance to resemble that of Avram for a twofold purpose. In addition to repudiating the words of the scoffers, making Yitzchak's countenance resemble Avram's, that was a reason why Hashem made Yitzchak look like Avram. But if that was the only reason, that would have been recorded earlier in the Torah. That would have been hinted at something earlier in the Torah. But there's another message that has to do, that it also communicates a fundamental message that continues to remain relevant even after the scoffers' words were proven false. One that relates to the very essence of Yitzchak's spiritual characteristics and his path in divine service. In other words, that only when we are dealing with Yitzchak's divine service, when we're dealing with what's going on with Yitzchak's life as we'll soon explain, that Parshas Toldos is about Yitzchak's life, is it important to emphasize this special idea, the special concept that Avram Hoiludas Yitzchak. Just to give an idea of where he's going with this, that he wants to let us know that what Yitzchak stood for, that what Yitzchak's life was about, was not a contradiction or different or in opposition to what Avram stood for. Avram was Chesed and Yitzchak was Gvura, but actually what Yitzchak was all about was really a continuation and even complementing Avram, and that's why it was necessary here in our parsha to say Avram Hoilidas Yitzchak. Avram was the one that fathered Yitzchak, to let us know not just that the Leitzoni Ador, the scoffers, would have realized that, but also for the message about Yitzchak's life and what he was about. It's important to emphasize the continuation from Avram. Next page, it says the Torah introduces Parshas Toldos with this concept to call attention to it. That's why he begins right away the beginning of Parshas Toldos with it. Parshas Toldos comprises primarily a description of the life history of Yitzchak. In other words, there are different parshas of the Torah that will speak about different avos, and sometimes the same parsha in the Torah will talk about multiple people of the avos. Some parts will talk about Avram and Yitzchak. Some parts will talk about Yitzchak and Yaakov. Some parts will talk about only Yaakov, only Yitzchak, only Avram. The parsha of Toldos is about Yitzchak primarily. So he says in the parentheses, although Yitzchak is also mentioned in the previous Torah reading. Parshas Chayesarim, the focus there is a continuation of the narrative of the life of Avram. In other words, it's all about Yitzchak as he had to do with Avraham. Not so much Yitzchak of he himself. Yitzchak's marriage, Avraham went to send and get a wife for him, etc., etc. And the same thing later on, next week's Parsha, the following Torah reading, Parsha Vayetze, begins the focus on Yaakov. It is specifically in Parshas Toldos that the events that took place in Yitzchak's life are given detailed focus. And later on the Sicha, we'll see how the Rebbe actually examines many different parts of Yitzchak's life in light of what he was about and how all of those things fit into the idea of Yitzchak as it's exemplified in his name, etc. Thus, one of the interpretations of the word Toldos is that it refers to the offspring, in essence, products, i.e. of Yitzchak's days and the events that occurred to him, meaning it's not offspring in just the biological sense. Toldos in Lashon Kodesh can also mean, like we used the term in the beginning, chronicles, talking about his life story, not only about the simple meaning. Ela Toldos Yitzchak was Yaakov and Esav, or the Toldos Yitzchak, like Rashi says. But Toldos means the events, the occurrences that occurred with him, because that is the primary focus of Parshas Toldos. And here in Parshas Toldos, where we are about Yitzchak, that's where it's important to connect him with Avraham. It is precisely at this point that the verse is thus emphasizing that a crucial element in the account of Yitzchak's life story is that Avraham fathered Yitzchak, i.e. that Yitzchak resembled Avraham as Yitzchak alone, not as Yitzchak was in Parshas Chayesar or in earlier Parshas. So he says in section 2, we find two contrasting thrusts in the Torah regarding Yitzchak's fundamental character traits and his path in Avodas Hashem, divine service. It is, as is well known, our patriarch Yitzchak is identified with the attribute of fear. Therefore, the Torah speaks of Pachad Yitzchak, that why as we say Pachad Yitzchak, it talks about the one Yitzchak feared. In this lies the difference between the divine service, Avodas Hashem of Avram, and that of Yitzchak. Avram's Avodas Hashem divine service was characterized by the attributes of love and kindness. Thus, the Navi speaks, the prophet speaks of Avraham who loved me, Avraham Oyhavi, because that was the Avodas Hashem of Avram was an Avodah out of Ahava. Whereas Yitzchak's divine service was characterized by the attributes of awe and fear, his avodah was an avodah of yira. That is a common thing that is brought down in many places. But we will now bring a whole bunch of things that seem to show a totally different side to Yitzchak's character. Nevertheless, there are a number of factors that reflect a connection and association between Yitzchak and the attributes of love and kindness as well. And the Rebbe says among them, he doesn't even limit it and say it was only these things, but it was among those things that indicate, and at the end he's going to say, at the conclusion of enumerating the next few things, he's going to say, void, and there's still more things which the Rebbe doesn't mention. He says, let's begin right at the beginning. That's the best place to start. What's the beginning of Yitzchak, his birth? Let's look at the time of his birth. The beginning of his life, i.e. the time of his birth. Our sages state that Yitzchak was born on Pesach. As it is well known, each of the three Yomim Tovim corresponds to one of the three Avos, patriarchs, Pesach to Avram, Shavuos to Yitzchak, and Sukkot to Yaakov. Yitzchak was born on the festival Yom Tov corresponding to Avram. It is plainly clear that this was not merely coincidental, but instead is intrinsically connected to the inner theme represented by Yitzchak's birth. Since Yitzchak resembled Avram, as we said right away at the beginning of our parsha, that Hashem made him resemble, that everyone could tell that Avram fathered Yitzchak, who is identified with love and kindness. That's why he was born on the festival, the Yom Tov, identified with Avram. So right away from the date of his birth, we see that he's associated with the characteristic that Avram is known for, the idea of kindness. A second thing, B, his name Yitzchak derives from the same Hebrew root as the word for laughter, tzchoik. As Sarah exclaimed, God brought me laughter. That tzchoik also le'elakim, linking Yitzchak with joy. Although joy is antipodal to awe and fear, it's the seemingly polar opposite of awe and fear. Nevertheless, Yitzchak's name reflects the attribute of joy. So, and the Rebbe even says in a footnote, this is the idea that in Tehillim he's even called Yitzchak with a sin, which indicates the idea of laughter. So again, joy is not seemingly about gevura and awe and fear and so on. See, the Torah describes Yitzchak with the verse, the man became great, vayigdal ha'ish ad ki gadol ma'od, his prosperity continued to increase until he was truly prodigious, i.e. Yitzchak is identified with the ultimate manifestation of divine kindness and greatness. The level of Gedula, he points out in the footnote, the Rebbe, Gedula in Kabbalah and Chassidus is identified with Sfiras HaChesed. When we say that Yitzchak was great, Gadol, that shows on Hashem's manifestation of expansiveness and kindness and inclusiveness. That's why we have in the davening, we say from Tehillim, L'cha Hashem ha'gedula v'agvura v'atferes v'neitz v'ahoid. He's going through all the spheres over there. How is identified the sphere of Chesed? Gedula. So Gadol, especially Ma'od, as we will emphasize later in the Sicha, indicates Hashem's the level of Chesed of Hashem. D, another thing, it says in the Navi, and this is also brought down, we say this in the Haggadah, it is written, I will multiply his descendants. That Hashem told Avram, Va'ar be'ezaroi. And it says further in the pasuk, "Ve'eten lo yes Yitzchak." How did he multiply Avram's descendants? That prophecy was fulfilled because I gave him Yitzchak, even though Yitzchak seemingly was only one person. I.e., Yitzchak is identified with multiplication and expression of kindness. Even though he was one, Hashem calls him Va'arba, increase, growth. Increase and growth show on the idea of chesed. So here we see, and then the Rebbe concludes, Va'oid, in the Hebrew. It doesn't say this actually, it's left out over here in the English. But in the Hebrew, it says Va'oid. There are more examples, the Rebbe says, where this can be found, the midah of kindness that's associated with chesed. So now he's going to say in 3, it appears possible to resolve the paradoxical elements mentioned above. This type of contradiction, this theater that we're talking about over here, seems to be missing an explanation. How do both of these things fit together? On the basis of a well-known concept, the Rebbe is going to propose an idea, but he's going to dismiss the idea. But first, he's going to propose the following idea. On the basis of the well-known concept that Avram and Yitzchak each manifested different and even opposite thrusts, but only with regard to the primary orientations in their divine service. Meaning, although Avram's primary thrust of divine service embodied the attribute of chesed, kindness, it was not confined to that thrust alone. It also incorporated the attributes of gvura, might, and yira, awe. And as Hashem explicitly tells Avram, now I know that you are God-fearing, that even though his service was normally with love, but when Avram withstood the test of the Akedah, which was an expression not of Avram's kindness, but it was an expression of his yira of Hashem, his awe and bittul to Hashem, so we saw manifested that Avram also had the flip side as well. The same holds true regarding Yitzchak. Even though his divine service was primarily identified with the attribute of Yira, awe, it also incorporated the attribute of Chesed, kindness. Because this is, by the way, the nature of a human being that distinguishes him from both the animal kingdom and from Malachim. I think we might have mentioned this in the Shir last week, that a Malach can only do one shlichus, meaning he can only do one type of service. He can only either heal Avram, he can only even kill out the people of Sodom. He's a one-trick pony. And the same thing, animals. Some animals are cruel, some animals are kind, etc. You don't have a mixture of different things. A human being is unique, that he has all different types of qualities. So even Avram, that was primarily about chesed, he had within him also the level of yira and awe and bittul. And Yitzchak had the other thing. Yitzchak was primarily gvura, but he had in it also chesed. On this basis, the Rebbe says it's possible to explain that the intent of the second phrase in the opening verse of the Torah reading, Avram fathered Yitzchak, why does it come to tell us? What's it meaning by saying Avram, that hoiled as Yitzchak, that Hashem caused Yitzchak's countenance to resemble that of Avram, is not solely that his physical countenance resembled Avram's, but that he also possessed a spiritual resemblance to Avram. Yitzchak's divine service also incorporated a certain degree of service of love, which is identified with his father Avraham. So that is what a possible explanation that Rebbe wants to suggest. How come it says Avram? How do we resolve the contradictory natures of Yitzchak, that Yitzchak is called by name associated with laughter, and many other things of Yitzchak are seemingly a manifestation of the idea of kindness and love and expansiveness. At the very same time, we're saying Yitzchak is the level of Pachad Yitzchak, Yira and awe and so on. Because as a complete human being, he included within them both. And Avram, Toldos Yitzchak, Avram's kindness was also part of the makeup of Yitzchak. So the Rebbe says, nevertheless, this explanation is not entirely satisfactory. How come? The fact that the very name Yitzchak is universally and forever identified with the concept of happiness compels us to say that this attribute reflects Yitzchak's fundamental orientation and not merely a secondary dimension of his character, like the Rebbe often emphasizes. The name that something is called in Lashon Kodesh, that is what it's truly about, and that is what his chayis is about. So therefore, if he's called Yitzchak, so then that's who he is, and everything else should only be ancillary and auxiliary to that. Not only that, specifically the word Yitzchak, the idea of schoik, of laughter, that shows even more so what is primary and what is auxiliary. He says at the top of the next page, moreover, there's a well-known distinction between Gila and Simcha, gladness and joy. Gladness, Gila, refers to feelings of joy that are not entirely manifest and apparent. It could be more internal. It's not something that's visible outwardly. Therefore, gladness can coexist with awe and trembling, as it is written, serve Hashem with awe, be glad while trembling. It says, Ivdu es Hashem biyira v'gilu berada. So in the trembling is concealed inside, in other words, inside the trembling is concealed the gladness. But you'll only use the term gila for that. You won't say simcha berada. Simcha berada doesn't fit, because simcha means an outward joy. If you're saying gila berada, that means outward there's the trembling, there's the awe, and internally there's the joy. By contrast, joy is identified with revealed happiness. According to the above, Yitzchak was given his name because he was identified with revealed feelings of laughter. His name reflects revealed happiness rather than gladness that is incorporated with awe. Being glad while trembling. It is thus obvious that Yitzchak's physical resemblance to Avram did not stem solely from the fact that their emotional traits were interrelated, which is why Yitzchak's divine service also incorporated the attribute of love, because he had, in addition to his awe, he had love also. That's not a sufficient explanation because he was called Yitzchak. From the fact that he was called Yitzchak, we must come to the conclusion, but rather that joy constitutes a singular and fundamental element of Yitzchak's very being. So he says in form, to offer a possible explanation, one of the distinctions between love, which is the attribute of Avram, and awe, the attribute of Yitzchak, is that love engenders a relationship of intimacy between the one who loves and his beloved. So it's about bringing the one who loves closer to the thing that he is loving. However, it does not cause the one who loves to become bottle, to nullify his own being for the sake of his beloved. On the contrary, through love, the identity of the one who loves and the intimate relationship between him and his beloved become accentuated. In other words, I feel myself more. When I am loving something, there is, like Chassidus used the terminology, yesh misha oyev. There is a person who is loving. So that means I've not lost my identity. Just the opposite. Where does a person lessen his identity, more in a state of bittul? By contrast, awe, yira, engenders bittul within a person. It causes him to forego his personal boldness and sense of self and ego to such an extent that his identity becomes subsumed, swallowed up, completely nullified within that of the one of whom he's in awe. Like when you're standing in front of someone that's in awe, you try to take up as little space as possible. You try to make yourself the least visible and the least noticeable. These concepts can be illustrated through a contrast between a son and a servant, meaning the relationship between a son and his father versus the relationship of a servant and his master. The foundation of a father-son relationship stems, for the most part, from their mutual feelings of love. The son's love for his father does not in any way nullify the son's identity. On the contrary, as the son exists within his own identity, meaning as he is a person, he feels closeness and love towards his father. His love and closeness to his father does not make the son lose himself and find himself a lesser person and a lesser being. A servant's relationship with his master, by contrast, hinges for the most part on the attribute of awe, that the servant is in awe of his master. As a result, he subsumes his identity to that of his master and accepts the yoke of his servitude, submitting himself to him. He makes himself less in the presence and for the sake of his master. Using that two-pronged approach, the difference between Ava versus Yira in the human realm, we can understand how that is in the Ava V'Jut Hashem and the Yira. Similar concepts apply to the parallels to these two types of relationships in our divine service. As is well known, Jews relate to God both as his children and as his servants. As is written, you are children unto God your Lord, and as God says of the Jews, they are my servants. Like we know in the davening, it says, im kibonim, im kavodim. That's the expression we say in the Rosh Hashanah davening, Yom Neroim davening. And we find this psukim that say, bonim atam l'Hashem Elokeichem, and bonim psukim that says, avodayhem. And the same thing, the other thing, that we address Hashem both as our Father, like you're soon going to say, Kiata Avinu, and also Malkeinu, contemplating God's intimate relationship with the Jewish people, that you are our Father, arouses and reveals our love for Hashem. Conversely, contemplating that He is our King arouses and reveals our awe and bittul to Him. So, just like in the Rosh Hashanah davening we say, Im kibonim, im kavodim, the same thing when we address Hashem during the Aseret Mitzvah, we also use those two much more often than during the year, even though this is also said during the year. Avinu and Malkeinu. Avinu is about the relationship of love that we have for Hashem, which is not about our bittul, whereas the Malkeinu is about the relationship of awe, like a servant that engenders with us bittul. The way in which these two emotions, love of Hashem and awe of Him, operate within a person's soul differs. Love arouses feelings of intimacy between man and Hashem, whereas awe causes a person to feel humble in Hashem's presence and to become bottled to Him. So he's going on in section 5. It is, however, critical to emphasize that this bittul and submissiveness neither be identified with nor expressed as sheep-like docility. He is not such a it's not a bittul which makes the person a non-functioning entity. That's not what we're doing. That's not the aim of the bittul over here. Not only must a person take care that this bittul not lead to becoming a doorstep over which people tread, on this is an expression that's called askufa nidreses. The people step on him. That's not the point of this bittul. A person needs to, even in a state of bittul, be aware of who they are, what they stand for, and not allow themselves to be stepped on. On the contrary, he should realize that it is precisely this bittul that also enables him, and that serves as a preparatory step in making him fit to draw close to Hashem. as we will explain a lot in the Sicha, that the bittul enables him to get closer to Hashem than if he wouldn't have the bittul, if he'd only be serving with Ava. To put it differently, the purpose of a person's feelings of awe and bittul is not so that he feels that he is nothing, devoid of self-worth. That's not the purpose. We're not trying to take away a person's value and importance even in their own eyes. On the contrary, he should realize that he is able to draw close to Hashem because, by virtue of his being batel. And the more bittul he's going to say, the closer he can become to Hashem. Indeed, the degree of intimacy with God that a person can attain through the preparatory step of bittul is far more powerful than the degree of intimacy that can be attained through love alone. Since love is intrinsically bound up with a person's consciousness of his own identity, that he is drawing closer to God, like we said before, he is aware of himself, I'm in love with Hashem, and being that the person is merely a created being with inherent limitations. By the very nature, anything that's created, anything that's not God, is limited. So therefore, being that I am limited, his intimacy with Hashem will necessarily also be limited. Because I'm limited, how can my connection with Hashem be beyond that? It is only by virtue of a person nullifying his identity, which is achieved by his arousing the attribute of awe within his soul, yira, that he makes himself fit to be a medium, a channel for receiving the godly revelation that transcends all limitations. Dafke, the bittul, allows him to connect with Hashem in a way that would have been impossible for him otherwise. This motif is reflected in the verse, Morim v'kodesh eshkoin v'sdako v'shval ruach, I dwell with the lofty and the holy ones, and with those who are contrite and humble of spirit, implying that God's loftiness and holiness are to be found specifically among those who are dako v'shval ruach, who are contrite and humble of spirit. So the highest, most levels of Hashem connect dafka with someone that's batel. This dynamic is reflected in the second example given above, the relationship between a servant and his master, regarding which our sages state, the servant of a king is a king. In Lashon Kodesh, Eved Melech Melech, which is an amazing concept. Just to give a simple example, if the king's servant comes into the town and announces something, they realize that he is speaking on behalf of the king, so they accord him full respect and full attention to his words as if the king were speaking. Because the servant of the king is the king himself, in other words. He's embodying the king's wills and so on. And that's because he's a servant, not a son, not an officer. Precisely because he is a servant, he becomes a medium in which and through which the king's power is revealed. Since his entire existence is defined by his being a servant of the king with no identity or power of his own whatsoever, the power he manifests is nothing more than the power of the king that is revealed through him. So he's totally king and nothing of his own. He's not a separate entity whatsoever. Section 6. The above explanation serves to clarify the meaning of the twofold request that we say in Shemoneh Esrei. Every day we say, V'nafshi ka'ofer lakol tia, let my soul be as dust to all. Psach libi b'sayresecha, open my heart to your Torah. So the Rebbe says this very phrase is a contradiction from the beginning of this phrase to the end of the phrase. These two entreaties, two different requests. I want my soul should be like dust and open my heart to the Torah, seem to reflect opposite thrusts, opposite approaches, characteristics. Let my soul be as dust to all expresses utter bittul, like dust on which all tread. Whereas open my heart to your Torah points to a person's identity, his heart feels and comprehends, and moreover, it is open and receptive. Such spiritual self-expression and expansiveness are the very opposite of bittul. If he's bottle, he's not like opening his heart to the Torah. He is a small little person. Who am I to understand the Torah? My heart and mind should be open. How can it be said that the means to open one's heart to the Torah is by making one's soul as dust to all? Because that's the precursor. It begins, let my soul be as dust to all, and then open my heart to your Torah means that this builds, one builds on the other. If you're like dust, how are you opening your heart to anything? How are you opening your heart to Torah? However, the Rebbe explains, it is precisely this paradox that enables one to be a medium for the Torah, without first making one's soul as dust to all, i.e., if a person's preparatory efforts at making himself fit to grasp the words of the Torah entail nothing more than toiling with his mind and wisdom, that's his whole thing. All I have to do, haravin and learning, you give a Torah, you guide to matzasi. I gotta just put in effort. That will still cause that his knowledge and his connection with Torah will be limited. He will never be capable of truly opening his heart to, the Rebbe emphasized, b'Torah Sicha. There's an emphasis over here in the original Sicha on the letter Chaf. Your Torah, similar to what the Rebbe Sicha is about Chanukah, he talks about a lot. It's your Torah. Hashem's Torah, he'll never connect to without bittul. For the Torah is Hashem's wisdom transcending entirely the finite reaches of a created being's intellect. And therefore, and by virtue of his own power, if a person is only understanding Torah based on his own mind and comprehension and wisdom, a person is capable of grasping only the most limited dimension of Hashem's chachma, of Hashem's wisdom. That building on his own mind blocks him from being able to appreciate Torah Sicha. Sach libi b'Torah Sicha, connecting to your Torah, the Torah the way Hashem knows his Torah. If, on the other hand, a person nullifies his own identity to the extent that he views himself merely as dust, indeed as dust to all, that's the ultimate level. There's some people are very choosy. I'll be like dust to the Rebbe, but to somebody else, I won't be like dust. I'm a chashuv person. So, but that's not the means. Nafshi ka'afar lakoilti. I have to be like dust before all. He makes himself a fit medium to receive and to understand and grasp God's Torah when there is no self-ego blocking it. Moreover, not only will he be able to understand and grasp, but his heart will be open to your Torah. He will achieve the true expansiveness. That's why I use the word psach, totally open, that accompanies an open heart, which enables him to grasp your Torah, Torah Sicha, God's Torah, as it transcends the finite intellect of a created being, because I'm not approaching it as a created being. I'm not approaching it with my ego and identity. I'm approaching it with a total self-abnegation, with a total state of bittul. This is possible because his opening of his heart is devoid of any sense of his own selfhood that would prevent him from grasping Hashem's Torah as it transcends the existence of the created beings entirely. Accordingly, the person will be focused solely on opening his heart in a holy manner because there's no sense of self whatsoever. Now we've established the background necessary to be able to understand what exactly was the function of Yitzchak's yira, his bittul, and how that very bittul enabled him and brought him to all the expansiveness that we brought about at the beginning of the Sicha that Yitzchak was about. Number 7. All the above concepts can be linked to Yitzchak. The awe manifested by Yitzchak was a preliminary step that made him fit for experiencing the joy and openness of his heart in his divine service that are engendered through the preparatory stages of bittul. Just like it says, Nafshi for la koiltia, psachli v'seresecha, the same thing, Yitzchak's bittul allowed him to be Yitzchak joyous, allowed him to have the growth and expansiveness. He was therefore named Yitzchak, a name associated with laughter and joy that reflects an expansive spiritual self-expression. Indeed, self-expression that knows no bounds. Where do we see that joy has to do with no bounds? As is well known, Simcha Peiris Geder, joy breaks through all barriers. The awe and bittul Yitzchak manifests leads to the revelation of intensified divine vitality, a genuine, expansive expression of holiness as reflected by the request, open my heart to your Torah, psachli b'seresecha. That is a result, and that is what's gained through the bittul of nafshi kafla kaltia. The same thing, Yitzchak's bittul brought him to the level of tzchaik, the complete level of laughter and openness, etc. It is this very concept that is communicated by the seeming redundancy in the verse. These are the chronicles of Yitzchak, Ela Toldos Yitzchak, Ben Avram, the son of Avram, and Avram, Toldos Yitzchak, Avram fathered Yitzchak. Yitzchak so closely resembled Avram that he was even born on Pesach, the Yom Tov associated with Avram. For Yitzchak's divine service of awe was a means of drawing close to Hashem, the mode of service manifested by Avram. So he was a continuation of all of that. He wasn't a contrast to the avoid of Avram. But his drawing close was in a manner that went beyond Avram's drawing close. However, Yitzchak drew close to Hashem in an utterly transcendent manner without any limitations in a way that exceeds the finite capacity of a created being. Such closeness could be engendered only by means of awe and bittul, which was Yitzchak's trademark. This concept that Yitzchak's spiritual service was characterized by joy and openness of heart, the soul's expansive self-expression, was also manifest in the way he lived his life, which is many parts of the themes in Parshas Toldos. As his soul was enclosed in his body, and even in how he conducted himself in physical matters. As the Torah reading relates, Yitzchak enjoyed a unique dimension of prosperity, even with regard to his material circumstances. Indeed, this is the subject of the major part of this Torah reading that we speak about, how Yitzchak was very successful in a very expansive way in his life. The Torah's narrative concerning Yitzchak's personal circumstances opens with Hashem's command to him, Al Teir Mitzrayim, do not descend to Egypt, Gur Baruch Azois, dwell in this land, highlighting a distinction that only he and not Avram or Yaakov enjoyed. Avram could go down to Mitzrayim, Yaakov moved to Mitzrayim. It was specifically Yitzchak who was designated as a korban oile, perfect burnt offering. And he alone was sanctified to the extent that it says, the Chazal say, living in the diaspora does not befit you. Chutz la'aretz is not a roy for Yitzchak. Avram was okay with Chutz la'aretz. Yaakov was even more okay with Chutz la'aretz. This reflects the concepts described above, that Yitzchak through awe and bittul became a medium for holiness that transcends the limitations of this world. This unique manner of Yitzchak's divine service served as the conduit through which manifold material divine blessings were drawn down to him. So we see another thing, this powerful connection that he had with Hashem, this amazing bond that was greater than Avram and Yaakov's, enabled him to, in the physical world, have amazing blessings. As the narrative proceeds to relate, Yitzchak received manifold blessings, brachas while in Geror. That it says, Vayigdol ish vayelach halach v'gadol at yigadol ma'od. The man became great. His prosperity continued to increase until he was truly prodigious. Gadol ma'od in Chassidus, ma'od, always a Chassidus identified with bli gvul, without any boundaries. i.e., Yitzchak was blessed with material prosperity that exceeded all limits. That's why he uses the term ki gadol moed vayigdal ish vayelach halach v'gadol moed, over the top. Why? Because again, his connection with Hashem was an over-the-top connection because of his bittul. He was able to connect with Hashem's infinite, just like we said before, that if a person has nafshi kafir lakol tiyah, if his soul is like dust before everyone, so then he's able to connect to Hashem in an infinite way. The same thing, Yitzchak's bittul allowed him to connect with Hashem in a way that Hashem's infinite aspect revealed itself down here, even in his physical and material blessings. Another story that we have about Yitzchak's life, the Torah then relates that Yitzchak dug wells, concluding with the third well, which he named Rechoivos, because Hashem has granted us expansive prosperity in Lashon Kodesh Rachvus, and we will be fruitful in the land. The narrative then proceeds to describe at length the brachas that Yitzchak bestowed, v'yitl chalakim mital shemaim, and so on. Blessings of brachas of a lofty nature. As the Alter Rebbe states, brachas like these that Yitzchak gave, v'yitl chalakim, and so on, were bestowed neither by Avram nor by Yaakov. When we find Avram giving brachas, we find Yaakov giving brachas. Nothing like that was ever bestowed like what Yitzchak said in v'yitl chalakim. Indeed, even the brachas that Moshe bestowed before he passed away were not comparable to those bestowed by Yitzchak. Why? What was so unique about Yitzchak? Now we understand his bittul, his yira. For it is specifically the attributes of awe and bittul exemplified by Yitzchak that elicit abundance, overwhelming vitality chayis, and divine beneficence that transcend limitations. So he says in 8, the Rebbe is going to take this, drill down into this even deeper, to explain the connection between the attribute of awe, exemplified by Yitzchak, and the concepts of abundance and prosperity. In greater depth, our sages state the patriarchs represent Hashem's chariot, or the lashon of Kabbalah, Chassidus, ha'avis hein amarkava. What's the significance of a chariot? A chariot is a vehicle. A vehicle has no will of its own. It's completely subsumed and nullified, bottled to its rider. Just as a chariot is entirely subordinate to its driver, who guides and controls the movement of the chariot as he so desires. And there's no aspect that the chariot wants to go somewhere else. It goes exactly, and it has no consciousness of its own. It's all about the driver. So too, all the patriarchs' concerns and actions were guided and controlled by Hashem's will. This was by all the others, not just Yitzchak. All the others had this in common. The same holds true regarding the attributes that the patriarchs manifested, be they kindness or might. It's not just that Avram was a Merkava and he did everything what Hashem wanted, like a channel, like a chariot follows its rider. But even the particular character traits with which he served Hashem, also these were driven by Hashem. They weren't Avram's own attributes, whether it was Avram's kindness or Yitzchak's gevura. The intent is not that they manifested these attributes because this was the nature of their souls. It doesn't mean that Avram was Oyavi, Avram was a Isha Chesed, Avram had love for Hashem because that was Avram's nature. And Yitzchak had Yira and Pachad Yitzchak, the awe and bittul of Hashem, because that was Yitzchak's nature. No. But that they were chariots for the expression of this divine attribute. Avram was a chariot expressing the supernal attribute of chesed, kindness. Accordingly, every aspect of his conduct reflected this attribute. And for this reason, his divine service primarily expressed the attribute of Ahava, love, because he was a chariot to the midah of chesed. Similarly, Yitzchak was a chariot expressing the supernal attribute of gevura, might. Therefore, his divine service primarily expressed the attribute of Yira, awe. But we need to understand that the attribute of Gevura and might, the way it's in Kedusha, is a very positive type of attribute. It is explained, 9, he says, that although it might seem otherwise in its root and source, the divine attribute of Gevura is not characterized by judgment and contraction. The term Chassidus is tzimtzum, i.e. the withholding of divine influence, which one might think is the idea of Gevura. It's about Hashem being mitzamtzim himself, Hashem constricting himself. Instead, Gevura, as the very word implies, reflects powerful and heightened energy. Thus, our sages speak of Gevuras Hageshamim, the might of the rains. It says, we say Mashav Ruach Moed Geshem, we say it in the bracha of Ata Gibor La'olam Hashem. Why do we say it in that bracha? Because Geshem, rain, is Hashem's might. But might is not in its source a withholding and a withdrawal and chas v'shalom punishment and judgment. No, it's actually a very powerful flow and an expression of Hashem. The difference between the attributes of Chesed and Gevura, if both of them are giving, and even Gevura is not essentially in its source about withholding. So what's the difference? Is that Chesed is identified with bestowing beneficence to another. As such, that beneficence is meted out in accordance with the capacity of the recipient in order that he be capable of accepting it. Chesed is about helping someone else out. It's not about just expressing my full might. Therefore, I look at the recipient, I look at the receiver, I look at the makabel, and I see how to dole it out in the correct amounts and measurements that the makabel, the receiver, can accept it. Therefore, chesed, it has to come through certain channeled, defined, limited levels to a certain degree. By contrast, Gevura bestows an overwhelmingly powerful beneficence. It's the full might and the full strength, without taking consideration the recipient's capacity, but rather in accordance with the power of its bestower. And that's why it is sometimes translated as judgment. Because when the recipient doesn't have the appropriate bittul, he's not able to accept it, and it overwhelms him. He says this in the brackets, however, as a consequence, especially when the recipient does not have the capacity to receive such an abundance of beneficence. In other words, because he's lacking bittul. When a person lacks bittul, that's when Hashem's judgment manifests. It's connected. The judgment is because I don't have the bittul, so automatically it overwhelms me all the good that Hashem has given me. The attribute of Gevura, through the process of ishtalshalos, the progressive downward chain-like process which divine beneficence is conveyed to lower realms, just translated the word ishtalshalos, leads to contraction, severity, and the withholding of beneficence. In other words, the receiver is not able to receive all that is good. Too much good is too much for the receiver to receive. Like, for example, like Hashem says, he takes the sun out of its sheath when Mashiach comes, and Rishoyim will be judged by it, and Tzaddikim will be healed by it. Tzaddikim that have the appropriate bittul, they can handle the Shemesh Havaya. The sun is also analogous to Hashem Havaya. They can handle the full force of Hashem's revelation. But Rishoyim, they're blinded by this great light. And so for them, this is a state of Gevura, of might, which ends up, in their perspective, being severe. It blinds them. So therefore, what comes out from this? So The Rebbe says, firstly, it must be emphasized the divine attributes of Gvur and Din, might and judgment, respectively, that's what Gvur and Din mean, are not intended for the sake of judgment itself. Chas v'sholom, Hashem is not punitive. Hashem does not just punish, but rather, instead, their entire objective is solely to impart kindness. Any time when there is any type of judgment from above, it is all about Hashem's chesed. The Rebbe gives an example to cite a parallel, as is well known. The punishments that the Torah prescribes, it's not because Hashem wants to punish or see someone suffer, are not intended to serve merely as punitive measures, but rather are intended to cleanse and purify the transgressor. And by doing so, enabling him to be granted divine atonement for his misdeed. So therefore, this cleansing process is a positive thing. It's not a negative thing. For this reason, the entire Torah, including its punishments, is referred to as Torah's chesed, the Torah of kindness, because even the punishments are an expression of Hashem's chesed and kindness. The true attributes of love and fear to be employed by man in his divine service and the voice of Hashem are evoked by the two corresponding divine attributes of chesed, kindness, and gvura, which is the level of might. He goes on and says in the last page, the supernal attribute of chesed is identified with the flow of divine beneficence, which is meted out in accordance with the limitations of the created beings and their capacity to receive it. The expression of such kindness evokes feelings of love for Hashem within a person. As k'mayim aponim alponim, as water reflects an image, that when you show a certain image to the water, if you're smiling towards the water, a smiling face will look back to you. So therefore, if the chesed that Hashem shows to us, so it evokes by us the feeling of love. A person's perception of Hashem's kindness naturally calls forth a reciprocal response, arousing the person to draw close to Hashem, because Hashem is giving us something that allows us to be myself without the bittul. The supernal attribute of Gvura represents overwhelming divine energy that is beyond the limits of a created being to receive. So because we are in the presence of such a unbelievable, powerful revelation, so it arouses within a person feelings of yira, awe, and bittul. Therefore, these feelings in turn engender within him the capacity to receive this overwhelming energy. When he gets this might, he's overwhelmed by it. He's in a state of bittul. Now that the person is batal, he is able to receive Hashem's great power, because he has lost his limitations. He's become completely subsumed in Hashem, and he's able to receive this infinite level. This parallels the motif described above, that making one's soul as dust to all, nafshi kafel kol tia, enables a person to become a fit medium for his heart to be open to your Torah, psach livi b'soida secha. This is perhaps we could explain similar to what the Alter Rebbe says, and the Rebbe emphasized that when a person identifies that he is recognizes that any type of suffering he receives from above is really Hashem's goodness and kindness, so that means that he's in a state of bittul. That state of bittul that he has, in that state of goodness and kindness, allows it that the result of that, once you recognize that, the Alter Rebbe says, so then Hashem turns it over in such a way that he could see openly the good. From this explanation, it is clear that the attribute of awe manifested by Yitzchak and the attribute of love manifested by Avraham are not diametrically opposed. For the divine intent in arousing a person to reach awe and bittul is to facilitate the overwhelming expression of Hashem's kindness, enabling the person to draw close to Hashem with heightened intensity. So that's why he needs this greater bittul to be able to partake of an even higher level of Hashem's love. It is for this reason that we find that it was specifically Yitzchak who was able to bestow manifold best blessings, brachas, surpassing even those brachas granted by Avram and Yaakov, like Alter Rebbe says in Torah. The attribute of fear manifested by Yitzchak, the bittul of Yitzchak, elicits overwhelming abundance from above that transcends all limits. So his brachas were such as well, blessings of abundant goodness to the house of Israel, like the bracha is, like it says in the Navi, Rav Tuv L'Beis Yisrael Keroiv Chasodov, reflecting Hashem's abundant kindness. Rav Tuv is Keroiv Chasodov, like Hashem's kindness could be. These blessings lead to abundant goodness in material matters and abundant goodness in spiritual matters, and moreover that there be a fusion of the material and the spiritual, bringing about overt and apparent goodness that becomes actually manifest on the physical plane.